Something happened inside the Vatican 3 days ago that the world's most powerful billionaires did not want you to see. A private letter sent from the desk of Pope Leo XIV directly to the heads of the 10 largest corporations on Earth was leaked to a journalist in Brussels. By morning, it had been pulled from every major platform. By afternoon, 2 financial news networks had received legal threats warning them not to publish its contents. By evening, the Vatican press office had issued a statement so vague it answered nothing. And right now, somewhere between Geneva, New York, and Riyadh, a group of men worth a combined $14 trillion are deciding how to respond to a pope who just told them in writing that their model of wealth is a moral catastrophe. This is not a story about religion. This is a story about power, and the man at the center of it, Robert Francis Prevost, Pope Leo XIV, has just done something no sitting pope has done in over a century. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear gets much worse before it gets better. It was April 20th, 2026, less than 11 months after Robert Prevost walked onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica and spoke his first words as Pope to a stunned and grieving world. The Vatican had still been wrapped in mourning for Pope Francis, who had died on April 21st, 2025, a death that had shaken the Catholic Church and much of the secular world with it. Prevost had not been the obvious choice. He had not been the loudest voice in the conclave. He was an Augustinian friar from Chicago, a man who had spent decades working in Peru, who spoke quietly, who avoided cameras, and who had spent the better part of his priestly life among people the global economy had left behind. When he took the name Leo XIV, scholars noted the reference immediately. Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, the Church's foundational document on labor, capital, and the dignity of the working poor. That choice of name was not an accident. It was a declaration. And now, 11 months later, the world was finally beginning to understand what that declaration meant. The letter was 41 paragraphs long. It was addressed personally, not to companies, but to individuals. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Larry Ellison, Jensen Huang, Mark Zuckerberg, TT, Bernard Arnault, Larry Fink, Mukesh Ambani, Gautam Adani, and one name that surprised almost everyone when it leaked. A sovereign wealth fund director in Abu Dhabi whose identity the Vatican had never publicly acknowledged knowing. The letter did not ask for donations. It did not request meetings. It did not open with pleasantries or diplomatic softening. According to the journalist in Brussels who obtained it, a woman named Elise van der Meersch, who has covered the Vatican for 18 years, the letter opened with a single sentence from the book of James. "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." And then it got more specific. Now, you need to understand what was in that letter, because this is where it stops being symbolic and starts being structural. Because Leo XIV did not just quote scripture and call it a day. He laid out a case, a documented, sourced, referenced case built over what Vatican insiders say was 6 months of internal research conducted by a team of economists, theologians, and former development officials. People who had worked at the IMF, at UNICEF, at the World Bank. The Pope had assembled, quietly and without press coverage, what one source described to van der Meersch as a shadow commission on economic violence. And the findings of that commission were attached to the letter. The document cited specific labor practices at specific facilities in specific countries. It named port workers in Bangladesh earning less than $2 per day fulfilling orders for companies whose CEOs had seen their personal wealth increase by an average of 43% in the previous year alone. It cited algorithmic wage suppression, the practice, now documented in academic literature, of using AI-driven systems to predict the minimum wage a worker in a given zip code will accept before seeking employment elsewhere, and offering exactly that amount. It cited the consolidation of farmland across sub-Saharan Africa by investment vehicles tied to several of the men named in the letter. And it cited, most explosively, a specific arrangement in 3 countries. The names have not been publicly confirmed, where government officials received what the document called structured incentive payments in exchange for weakening labor protections ahead of major infrastructure contracts. That last section is what sent the lawyers scrambling, because if the Vatican's Shadow Commission had documented what it claimed to have documented, the men named in that letter were not just being called morally deficient. They were being told, implicitly and with sourced evidence attached, that the Holy See had information about conduct that in certain jurisdictions would constitute criminal liability. By the morning of April 21st, precisely 1 year to the day after Pope Francis died, Elise van der Meersch had published a summary of the letter's contents on her Substack. Not the full text, a summary. Within 4 hours, her internet service provider had received a legal notice. Her Substack page was flagged for unverified. 2 of the 3 sources she had cited in her summary received phone calls from lawyers they had never heard of, warning them that disclosure of confidential business communications was a violation of agreements they had signed years earlier and had largely forgotten. one of those sources, called Vandermeersch, back and told her, and I'm quoting here, "They move faster than I have ever seen anyone move. This is not normal crisis communications. This is suppression." And here's the thing that nobody is saying loudly enough yet. The Vatican did not deny the letter existed. The press office statement issued late on April 21st said only that the Holy Father engages in ongoing private correspondence with global leaders on matters of moral and social concern, and it would be inappropriate to comment on the contents of private communications. That is not a denial. That is a confirmation wearing a suit. So, what does Leo XIV actually want? What is the demand, if there is one? This is where it gets even more interesting, because the letter, according to Vandermeersch's summary, did not issue ultimatums. It did not say, "Do this or we will publish what we know." It said something that in some ways is more unsettling to men accustomed to transactional power. It said that the Catholic Church, its bishops, its parishes, its schools, its hospitals, its 1.4 billion members, was entering a new phase of what the letter called prophetic witness, and that this witness would include, going forward, a sustained public, liturgically integrated campaign of moral accountability, directed at the structures of extreme wealth concentration every Sunday in every diocese around the world. Think about what that means. Not a boycott, not a lawsuit, not a protest march that can be ignored or policed or outlasted. 1,400,000,000 people in every country on earth being told from the pulpit week after week that specific economic structures are incompatible with human dignity, and being given the names and faces and decisions of the people who built those structures. That is not a threat that a legal team can neutralize. That is not a news cycle that will pass. That is an institution with 2,000 years of practice and patient, persistent civilizational pressure, and a pope who, for the first time in a very long time, appears to be willing to use it. The reaction from the business community has been instructive in ways that are almost too on the nose. 3 of the men named in the letter have, through proxies, contacted the Vatican Secretariat of State requesting private meetings. The Vatican has not responded publicly to those requests. 2 others have donated suddenly and conspicuously to Catholic charitable organizations, donations announced with unusual speed and covered by outlets that typically do not cover philanthropy. One executive's communications team released a statement praising the Pope's commitment to dialogue and expressing eagerness to work together on shared goals of human flourishing. Nobody in the room where that statement was written believes a word of it. And at least one of the named individuals, according to a source in Geneva cited by a European financial publication, described Leo XIV in a private call as the most dangerous man alive. Let that phrase sit for a moment. The most dangerous man alive said about a 69-year-old Augustinian friar from Chicago who wears white, lives in modest quarters, and begins each day with morning prayer. What makes a person dangerous to the people who said that is not violence, it is not legal power, it is not armies or weapons or the ability to freeze assets. What makes Leo XIV dangerous to those men is that he has moral authority they cannot purchase, institutional infrastructure they cannot dismantle, and an audience they cannot algorithm their way out of. He is operating on a frequency their money does not reach. Now, step back for a second, because there's a context here that matters enormously that most of the coverage is missing. Robert Prevost did not arrive at this moment by accident. The choice of the name Leo was the first signal, but there were others, earlier and quieter. In his first encyclical published in September 2025, Leo XIV had used language that startled Vatican observers, not because it was radical, but because it was precise. He did not speak in generalities about poverty. He spoke about what he called systemic extraction, the deliberate design of economic systems, to move value from the many to the few, not as a side effect, but as a function. He cited by name 3 economic mechanisms, stock buyback programs, carried interest tax treatment, and offshore profit shifting, and described them as structurally incompatible with the gospel. Economists noticed, financial journalists noticed, but the story didn't fully break into mainstream consciousness because encyclicals are long and dense and most editors don't assign them to their best writers. The letter changed that because the letter was personal. It had names, it had specificity, it had, if Vandermeersch is correct, evidence. In Rome, the reaction inside the church itself has been fascinating. Senior cardinals who had been cautious about Leo XIV's economic agenda, men from wealthy dioceses in the United States, Germany, and Australia, who have spent decades cultivating relationships with major donors, have been noticeably quiet since the leak. Not supportive, not critical, quiet. Which, in Vatican politics, is its own form of communication. 2 bishops in the American Midwest have issued statements of enthusiastic support. A cardinal in Manila gave a homily 3 days ago that was essentially a line-by-line endorsement of everything in Vandermeersch's summary. In Brazil, a pastoral letter from the National Bishops' Conference described the Pope's position as the prophetic continuation of what this church in Latin America has known in its bones for 50 years, liberation theology. Has never been dead, it has been waiting. And there is one more layer to this that almost nobody is reporting, and it may be the most important layer of all. Van der Merch, in a follow-up piece published yesterday, revealed something about the timing. The letter was not sent in isolation. It was sent as part of what she described as a coordinated sequence. On the same day the letters went to the 10 billionaires, Leo XIV also sent a separate communication, shorter, more diplomatic in tone, but identical in substance, to the heads of state of the G7 nations. And he sent a third communication, which has not yet been fully described in any outlet, to a group of people Van der Merch calls only institutional investors with significant holdings in the named companies. Her source described this third communication as an invitation that functions as additions warning. She would not elaborate further in print, but her implication is clear enough. The Vatican is not just pressuring the billionaires directly, it is working to isolate them, to speak to the people whose capital keeps their empires functioning, to make the moral cost of continued association visible and explicit. This is not how popes have operated in living memory. This is, if it is what it appears to be, a sophisticated, multi-channel, coordinated campaign of institutional pressure executed with a precision that suggests either extraordinary strategic capacity inside the Vatican or outside advisors of significant caliber or both. And it is being run by a man who, 18 months ago, most people in the secular world had never heard of. Now, we have to talk about what happens next because the situation is genuinely fluid and the next 72 hours matter. There are three likely trajectories here, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is escalation by the named individuals. If any of them decide that the reputational risk of silence outweighs the reputational risk of public confrontation, we could see direct named criticism of Leo XIV, possibly framed as an attack on Catholic institutions, possibly framed as a defense of free enterprise, possibly framed in the language of religious freedom, which has been weaponized in political contexts before and could be again. The second is institutional pressure from within the church, the quiet. Cardinals becoming less quiet, donors threatening to redirect giving, politically connected bishops in the United States beginning to make noises about the Vatican overstepping. That pressure will not be loud at first. It will be administrative, financial, and whispered. But it will be real. The third trajectory, the one that Leo XIV appears to be banking on, is that the visibility of the response, the speed with which lawyers moved and platforms censored and statements were issued, has itself become the story, and that story is now impossible to contain. Every attempt to suppress Van der Merch's reporting has amplified it. Every legal threat has generated new coverage. Every conspicuous last-minute donation has looked exactly like what it is. The billionaires in their panic may have already handed the Pope the narrative he needs. There is something almost theological about that irony. A letter invoking judgment, provoking, as its immediate response, behavior that looks exactly like the behavior it was condemning. Men with $14 trillion moving their public relations apparatus at maximum speed to manage the optics of being confronted about their relationship with $14 trillion. The response is the confirmation. What does Robert Prevost himself look like in all of this? People who have met him, covered him, or worked near him in the last 11 months consistently describe the same thing. A quality of stillness. End quote. Not passivity, stillness. He does not perform urgency. He does not appear rattled by opposition. A journalist who attended a press briefing at the Vatican last month described watching him pause for 15 full seconds before answering a question about economic inequality, not to gather his thoughts, she said, but because he seemed to genuinely believe that the question deserved 15 seconds of silence before an answer. That is a different kind of power than the many he is confronting are accustomed to encountering. They are accustomed to speed, leverage, and transaction. He is operating in a register that those tools do not reach. There's a moment in Augustine, the theologian, not the friar order, though they are connected, where the question is asked, what do you love? Not what do you claim to love, not what you have built monuments to, but what, at the level of your deepest appetite, actually orients your life. Augustine's argument is that justice is not possible for a city, for a civilization, until it loves the right things, and the name Leo XIV, the Commission of Economists, the 41 paragraphs, the coordinated communications, the names and the evidence, and the stillness of the man at the center of it all, of it seems to be asking one question. Not, will you give more? Not, will you comply with our demands? The question is, what do you love? And if the answer is the accumulation, the system, the structure, then the prophetic witness will continue every Sunday in every diocese for as long as it takes. The men receiving that question are not used to it. They are used to questions they can answer with a number or a lawyer or a press release. This one, they cannot. And here's where we are today, April 23rd, 2026. Elise Vandermersch is preparing a third piece according to her Substack subscribers. She has indicated it will contain new information about the contents of the third communication, the one sent to institutional investors. 2 of the named billionaires have still not issued any public statement whatsoever, which is either strategic silence or evidence that their communications teams are still trying to figure out an angle. The Vatican Press Office has given no further statement beyond the one issued on April 21st. Leo XIV celebrated Mass this morning, as he does every morning, in the chapel of the Santa Marta Guest House with a small group of Vatican staff. There are no cameras allowed. There was no statement afterward. There was reportedly silence. Meanwhile, in parishes from Lagos to Lima to Los Angeles, priests who read the Vatican signals are beginning to prepare homilies. In seminaries, professors of Catholic social teaching are updating their syllabi. In Catholic secondary schools, in countries where the Church still runs significant educational infrastructure, teachers are discussing whether the economic content of their curricula should change. The apparatus is enormous. It moves slowly, but it has begun to move. And once it moves, it does not stop easily. The billionaires are furious. The Vatican is quiet. And somewhere between those two facts, something irreversible may already have happened. One more thing, because it matters, and it is being underreported. The date, April 20th, 2026, the day the letters were sent. April 21st, 2025, the day Pope Francis died. The overlap is not confirmed as intentional by any Vatican source, but it is the kind of detail that, in a tradition that has always been attentive to time, to calendar, to the meaning of when things happen, does not feel accidental. Leo XIII spent 11 months watching, learning what the institution was, learning what this moment required. And on the first anniversary of the death of the man who shaped so much of what the modern Catholic Church aspires to be, he sent 41 paragraphs to the 10 richest men he could identify and asked them, with evidence attached to account for themselves, that is either the beginning of something significant or it is a dramatic gesture that will fade into the archive of beautiful, ignored moral statements that powerful systems have always been able to outlast. The difference between those two outcomes depends on whether the apparatus follows the man, whether the 400 billion people understand what their Pope is asking of them, whether the institutional investors take the third communication seriously, whether Vandermeersch's third piece contains what her sources have suggested it contains. We don't know yet. Nobody does. But the men worth $14 trillion are acting like they're afraid, and that in itself is new. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this story matters, not as a religious story, not as a celebrity story, but as a story about the architecture of power and who, if anyone, has the standing and the will to challenge it. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next piece drops. Because Vandermeersch's third article is expected within 48 hours, and if her previous 2 are any indication, the story is about to become significantly more specific. The names, the numbers, the nature of that third communication, it's coming. And when it does, this channel will be the first place it's analyzed in full. Stay close.